3 generations of my family were born in India when it was under British rule. And so I grew up being taught to revere, and still do, Mahatma Gandhi. I then had a gap year before I went to university, and I was really spiritually searching that year. I was 17, and I spent a year in India. And I read a lot of Gandhi that year. And I read his autobiography, and this was a quote that I found arresting all those years ago. This is Gandhi. "I could accept Jesus as a martyr, an embodiment of sacrifice, a divine teacher. His death on the cross was a great example to the world. But that there was anything like a mysterious or miraculous virtue in his death, my heart cannot accept." Gandhi admired the sacrificial love of Jesus. Laying down your life for the sake of your friends is incredibly noble and is to be emulated. But Gandhi did not believe that it had any power beyond that moment to impact the world. How could a violent, brutal death bring peace and hope? Wondered Gandhi. What about modern-day terrorists? They think they're being noble when they blow themselves up in a crowded market. We now live in a world that if your children are surfing the internet, you have to make sure they don't come across an ISIS beheading video. So much blood, so much violence. Yet the primary symbol of the Christian faith has always been the cross. An instrument of torture and death so gruesome that even the Romans, who were not the cuddly, touchy type, even the Romans eventually outlawed it as a form of the death penalty in the 300s. The musician Billy Joel speaks for many people. "I was raised Catholic, and I viewed the business as a lot of enthralling hocus pocus. There's a guy nailed to a cross and dripping blood, and everybody's blaming themselves. But I said to myself, forget it. I had no hand in that evil. There's no blood of any sacred martyr on my hands. I pass on all of this." "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" the servant girl asked Peter. He replied, "I am not." The cross, which has always been considered good news by Christians, today is Good Friday, is increasingly seen by the rest of our culture as bad news. How can the torture and death of Jesus on a cross be good news? The crucifixion hadn't even happened yet, and Peter was already trying to distance himself from the coming violence and shame. "I do not know the man." How can the cross possibly bring a change in our lives that would positively impact us? Maybe in the way we parent our children, or handle our finances, or deal with that evil of terrorism that stalks our globe. Why the cross? Even Jesus wanted to know the answer to that question. In the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before he died, do I really have to do this? Is there no other way? Is there no other way than the cross? This morning at Christ Church, I want to circle around the cross. I want to look at how it is both unavoidable and beautiful. So first, how is the cross unavoidable. Now, all serious love requires an element of personal exchange. All real love requires some sense of sharing in what others experience, maybe even swapping places with them. And very often people will say something along the lines of this: look, I hear you about sin, it's real, it's destructive, and unlike Donald Trump, who has gone on record saying he's never asked God forgiveness for anything, most people will say, look, I get it, I'm culpable. But why can't God just forgive? If God's a God of love, why do we need the death of Jesus for God to forgive our sins? It's a good question. And the simple answer is that if you take away the cross, you've actually taken away the God of love. You've taken away the love of God. In an attempt to make God more loving, no need for a sacrifice, no need for costly forgiveness, we ironically make God less loving. Because without the cross, the love of God is just sentimentality. It is just a pious emoticon with no action. Because in the real world, in the lives that you and I actually live, love requires more than sentimentality. Real love requires getting in the trenches, even trading places. A few examples. My husband Tim and I have 3 teenage daughters. And children come into the world in a state of total dependence. And they can't survive unless their parents give up much of their own independence and freedom for many years. And if you don't allow your children to impinge on your own happiness or freedom or comfort, and if you will only care for your children when it doesn't inconvenience you, then your children will grow up physically, of course. But that is where it'll stop. In so many other ways, they will be damaged and stunted. Our oldest, Emma, went to Haiti a few years ago on a church trip. And Haiti is not an entirely safe developing country. And on a very small scale, Tim and I had to open ourselves up to increased kind of anxiety and stress for 2 weeks while she was in Haiti, so she could grow in maturity, so she could grow in wisdom. To love your children well, you must decrease so they can increase. The choice is clear. It's them or you. You have to sacrifice as a parent, or your children suffer. Or think of someone in life that you know who's difficult. Right? I'm sure there's nobody here at Christ Church like that. But imagine someone who's difficult, right? Who's emotionally damaged. They've had a really hard life. It is not possible to listen or love people like that and stay completely emotionally intact yourself. It isn't. The other person may feel supported and encouraged by your patience or understanding, but it always comes at a cost to you, the listener. It's draining. You always feel exhausted after spending time with them. Once again, it's them or you. Someone has to sacrifice. This time last year, and the week before Holy Week, you may remember in the news, there was an ISIS-affiliated terrorist who took hostages in a French grocery store. There was a French police officer, Arnaud Beltrame, and knowing that he was walking to his death, he offered himself to the terrorists in place of the hostages. And he strode across the parking lot into the grocery store. The hostages were freed. He was stabbed and shot, and later died in hospital. Turns out he was a practicing Catholic, and the Catholic priest who was going to be marrying him in 6 weeks' time gave him instead the last rites and married him and his fiancée in the hospital room before he breathed his last. All love that is not just sentimentality, that actually leads to a change, requires a sacrificial exchange. If you become personally involved, be they your child, a work colleague, or a hostage, then in some way, their weakness, their flaws, their suffering flow towards you, and your strength, your courage, your hope, your experience flows towards them. There is a sacrificial exchange. John Stott was a famous British Anglican priest of the past century, and he summed up this great exchange like this. The essence of sin is we human beings substituting ourselves for God, while the essence of salvation is God substituting himself for us. We put ourselves where only God deserves to be. God puts himself where we deserve to be. Because if God really is a God of love, how can God not become personally involved in the suffering and pain in people's real lives and the evil of the world? And this is where it's essential, my friends, to remember that Christians believe that Jesus is also the fullness of God. God is not like some primitive deity who demands blood for his anger to be appeased. No, we're not worshiping a monster who needs to be fed. No, we're worshiping and offers his own life in order for justice to be done and love to be shown. For God to be a God of real love, the cross is unavoidable. God must be willing to enter into the pain and suffering and evil. And only one belief system claims that that is exactly what God has done. Many of you here this morning have come bearing the troubles and burdens of real, ordinary life. And you're tired, and you'd love to put your burden down. Well, you've come to the right place on this solemn morning, because Jesus is the only person in the world who can, with all sincerity, look you in the eye and say, I understand. I know what you're going through. Isaiah 53, which Luigi read for us. He is despised and rejected, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. Any defeat, any relationship breakdown, any betrayal, any miscarriage of justice, any physical or psychological pain that you are experiencing, Jesus has walked that road of sorrows. Hebrews. For we do not have a high priest, Jesus, who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who in every respect has been tested as we are. In the trenches of real life, you know, real life where there's cancer and parenting and debt and marriage and divorce and loneliness and retirement and sexual violence, you know, real life. The problem of human suffering cannot be minimized. It cannot be explained away. And we can't just tie it up in a neat intellectual bow. I can't promise you that. But I can tell you that in the Christian story, that suffering has been shared. And in the real world of hard work and suffering and disappointment, don't ask me to worship a God who is immune to my suffering. But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. And with his stripes, we are healed. To talk about God loving us independently of the cross just makes the God of love sentiment. Who cares? We need a shamed God. We need a broken God. We need a bleeding God. We need a despairing God. The New Hampshire poet laureate Jane Kenyon grasped at this mystery of Good Friday. This is what she wrote. The God of curved space, the dry God, is not going to help us. But the Son whose blood spattered the hem of his mother's robe. For a God of love, the cross is unavoidable. The cross is also beautiful, a beauty with power. Charles Dickens wrote A Tale of Two Cities. And in this famous story, there are two men, Charles and Sidney, and they look very similar, and they're in love with the same woman, and her name is Lucy, right? As much as things stay the same, I'm sure there's many versions of this today. Charles and Sidney are both in love with Lucy, but Lucy chooses and marries Charles, and they have a child. And the backdrop of this story is the French Revolution. And Charles is a French aristocrat, and he's imprisoned and he's sentenced to death by the guillotine. And at the end of the novel, Charles is visited in prison by his old love rival, Sidney, and Sidney's English. And it's the night before Charles is going to be executed by the guillotine. And Sidney offers to exchange places with Charles. Charles refuses. But Sidney has him drugged and smuggles him away in a waiting carriage. And Sidney takes his place in the French prison. That very same night, a young seamstress who is also condemned to die comes up to Sidney and strikes up a conversation, thinking he's the Frenchman Charles. But she hears his English accent, and the penny drops. And her eyes just kind of open up wide. Are you going to die for him? Sidney responds, hush, yes. And I'm dying for Lucy, whom I love, and for their child. The young seamstress then confesses how terribly afraid she is, and how she's not sure she can face her own death. And she asks Sidney if he will hold her hand at the end. And when the time comes, they go to death hand in hand, and she finds herself composed, even hopeful, as long as she keeps her eyes fixed on Sidney as the blade comes down. The young girl was crumbling under the weight of her own fear. Yet the beauty of Sidney taking Charles's place strengthened her to face the ultimate test. This beautiful, unavoidable exchange that took place on the cross, God substituting himself for us, putting himself where we deserve to be, is the great exchange. And it creates a different kind of person, a different kind of culture, a different kind of response to evil. Because on the cross we have God, who is in the ultimate place of power and authority, reversing places with people like me, the arrogant, the greedy, the gossips, taking places with the marginalized, the poor, and the oppressed. And on the cross, all the values of our world are turned on their heads. Because Jesus, he wins through losing. And he achieves power through service. And he comes to wealth by giving it all away. And people who are shaped by the beauty in this great exchange no longer need to have their identity and hope and purpose in life justified by status, because Jesus lost it all, by money, power, race, anything. And because of the beauty of this exchange, Christians, for example, now think of money as something to give away, to fulfill God's purposes of justice and hope for all. Christians now look at things like power and skill and accomplishment as things to use to serve other people. On this Good Friday, we have before us an unavoidable beauty. As he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter tried to stop the cross from happening. He cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. Peter then denies knowing Jesus 3 times. He doesn't want to be associated with the coming devastation of his master, being crucified like a common criminal. Peter thought that the cross was avoidable and that it was a humiliation. But today we say no. Today we still our hearts. Today we repent. Today we worship. And today we give thanks for the unavoidable beauty of the cross. Three-personed God, fulfill the promise of your grace, that we, when all our searching ends, may see you face to face. Amen.